Hello everybody and welcome to Toitu to You, Curator's Corner, episode number 27. My name's Sean Brosnan. I'm a curator at Toitu Otago Settlers Museum here in Dunedin and offering these small stories about early Dunedin based on our collection and our history. One of the great pleasures of working at Toitu is having access to its rich collection of historic photographs. Now the collection isn't huge, it's not as big say as the Hocken Library's collection, but it's pretty rich and it's wonderful to be able to look at some of those historic images and to be reminded of how much work was involved in creating Dunedin from the primordial landscape that existed when the settlers first arrived here in 1848. Because it took years and years before the little primitive village that they began with developed into a township, and decades before the modern city emerged out of that primordial chrysalis. It's easy to forget how the site chosen for their township was rough and boggy, broken up by gullies and stream beds, and covered in thick vegetation. All of that had to be grappled with and gradually smoothed out into the flat or gently sloping surfaces that we enjoy today. So easy to negotiate with their asphalt footpaths and streets. This photograph, for instance, shows Lower Stuart Street in the 1850s. Now you can see from the label that it is described as a farm, and that in itself is something that I find quite delightful to contemplate when I walk along the footpath from Anzac Square to the Octagon. Now I'd wonder a bit about the date, 1850s. It's more likely closer to 1860 than 1850, and clearly a lot of work has already gone into taming the original landscape by this point. Here we have paddocks enclosed by fences, farm buildings and wooden houses, and the street itself has been formed, if not metalled. No doubt it was still a quagmire whenever it rained. Dunedin wasn't known as Mud Eden for nothing. But you can see that years of labour have been expended already developing this landscape for agricultural purposes. But if you look to the right of the picture, where we can see the slope of Bell Hill running down to meet the street line, you can still see some of the thick flax bushes that would have formerly covered the entire landscape here. It looks like a last remnant that's been left because it's in the gap between the private sections and the public street space. If you look to the end of Stewart Street itself, to where the railway station would be today, you can notice the top of a house which is sitting on what I would imagine must be the tidal zone of the original beach line, with Stewart Street itself apparently terminating at a sharp drop-off of a bank, so the street is on a level with the house's roof line. And at the left, there's that triangular wedge that encloses what looks like a watercourse, one of the many that crisscross the boggy ground of the Dunedin Flat, stretching away from here northwards, with numerous tidal inlets and bays indenting the shoreline as well. It looks like a good 2-metre drop from those bushes down to the exposed bed of that creek. Now it's quite hard to align this image with the modern landscape, but I'm guessing that it's probably somewhere just eastwards towards the harbour of where Moray Place intersects with Lower Stuart Street today. So where these fields would have been would be somewhere under the contemporary Highland House and that block along to the old A&T Burt's building, with the Allied Press premises somewhere around where the cluster of houses is, or perhaps just a little further east. And that would put the creek or watercourse or whatever it is somewhere under the Countdown supermarket. Now there's no particular science behind my analysis, so feel free to add your own interpretation in the comments. We can be much more certain about the location of my second image though. It's looking from a vantage point in Moray Place, across its intersection with Princes Street, and up the hill where we can see the top section of Stuart Street, up to the point where it veers right in what was then called Albert Street. All the buildings on Princes Street in the foreground were burned down in a great fire that swept through this area in 1867. But that's a story for another day. What I want to focus on here is again that landscape that you can see between the buildings. Look at Moray Place, just raw clay and earth and the clay bank that leads up to the properties above it, with a step set into the bank to provide access to each building. Imagine doing that. Then look at the rough grass and the flax bushes on the slope of Bell Hill. And let's notice too, the cart on Moray Place loaded high with rocks. Moving them out or moving them in, I wonder. Whichever it was, It's a sign of all the hard labour involved in transforming such landscapes into city streets. And look too at the gully that runs down to the left of Stuart Street, the artificial bank under construction along the line of Moray Place, and then the sharp drop-off from Princes Street to the continuation of that gully. Now you can still see that drop when you look down some of the alleyways that lead in behind the modern buildings of Moray Place today. But how often do we stop and think about the prodigious efforts that went into making these modern streetscapes? Well, I like to think about that quite often, in fact, and looking at these images helps me get a better picture of that amazing transformation to which we owe the beautiful city we enjoy today. And just to remind us of the actual sweaty toil that was involved, notice the ladders leaning up against the Criterion Hotel, and the 2, or is it 3, blurry figures working on them. But don't tell anyone from Occupational Safety and Health about the ladders. Scaffolds and hard hats would definitely be required today. So I hope you enjoyed that little story and that little peek behind the scenes of our historic photographs to imagine what Dunedin was like before the settlers got stuck in and began to develop our wonderful modern city.